I don't give a fuck who talk behind my back, cause the bitch knew better than to let me hear. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, hands on my knees, hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape. Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thigh shape.
A Milwaukee woman facing a 2018 homicide charge for the death of a man being investigated for sex trafficking was back in a Kenosha County courtroom Tuesday.
To a 2018 homicide of a man being investigated for sex trafficking. Now, she was 17 at the time of the murder.
So back in 2018, when Kizer was 17 years old, she allegedly shot and killed a man who she says was a known sexual trafficker. She claims that she was his victim.
What would you do if the only way to escape your worst nightmare was to become one yourself? June 5th, 2018, Kenosha, Wisconsin. A 17-year-old girl steps out into the night, her hands trembling as she grips the keys to a car that isn't hers. She slides into the driver's seat, her heart pounding against her ribs. In the rearview mirror, behind the glow of the flames, is the body of the man who once held her captive. Her name is Chrystul Kizer. To some, she's a cold-blooded murderer. To others, she's a survivor who did what she had to do. But before you judge, before you decide whether she was right or wrong, you need to hear what happened first. Because this isn't just a story about a crime. This is a story about power, control, and a system that was never built to protect girls like Chrystul. Before the headlines, before the crime scene, before the courtroom battles, Chrystul Kizer was just a little girl, growing up in a world that never gave her a fair chance. Chrystul was born into struggle. She came from a family that, like so many, did their best with what little they had. She was raised in Milwaukee, a city with deep racial divides where opportunity and hardship are separated by little more than a zip code. Her mother, a woman stretched thin between raising children and surviving the weight of poverty, worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat. But poverty is more than just an empty bank account. It's the echo of stress in every conversation, the sleepless nights wondering if tomorrow's problems will be bigger than today's. Chrystul was bright, playful, and full of dreams like any other little girl. But innocence doesn't last long in places where survival is a full-time job. As she got older, the cracks in her world became harder to ignore. The kind of safety other kids took for granted, it didn't exist for her. Chrystul was young, poor, black, a girl. The kind of girl that people overlook until it's too late. The kind of girl predators hunt for because they know no one is coming to save them. She was just 16 when she met Randall Voller, a grown man, a white man, a man with money. He had the kind of power she'd never known, the kind of control that could pull a girl like her in and never let her go. But Chrystul didn't see the monster at first. That's the thing about predators. They don't show their teeth until they know you can't escape. And by the time Chrystul realized what Voller was, she was already trapped. Welcome to True Crime Depot, where we uncover the hidden truths behind tragedies that demand attention. Our mission is to bring light to stories that deserve to be heard and to honor the voices that can no longer speak for themselves. If stories like this captivate you, we invite you to become a part of our growing family. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore more gripping and unforgettable cases. To the outside world, Randall Voller was just another man living in Kenosha, Wisconsin. But behind the doors of his quiet home, he was leading a double life, one that would eventually catch up to him. Randall Philip Voller III lived a life that, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. He was a 34-year-old white man, quiet, tech-savvy, and financially stable. Though not widely known in the community, Voller came from a well-off background. His family was far from struggling. They had money, influence, and stability. Despite this, Voller never followed in his father's footsteps. Instead of a government career, he worked independently with computers, making a living through various tech-related jobs. Voller lived alone in a modest yet well-kept house, spending most of his time on his laptop or watching anime. He rarely socialized. His life revolved around the internet, Neighbors never suspected anything sinister. He wasn't the type to cause trouble or draw attention to himself. If anything, he seemed quiet, even forgettable. But behind closed doors, he was far from harmless. Randall Voller had a dark obsession, one that law enforcement already knew about. By early 2018, police had already identified him as a predator. He had been actively engaging with multiple underage girls, making secret recordings, and luring them into situations where he had full control. In February 2018, authorities finally acted. They raided his home, seizing his electronics, phone records, and video evidence that should have been enough to put him behind bars. Law enforcement's investigative file on Voller at the time noted that he had hundreds of child sex videos with girls as young as 12, and more than 20 home videos, included Voller specifically with underage black girls. And yet, he walked free. Law enforcement never arrested him, never charged him, never even made his crimes public. Instead, they labeled the case an ongoing investigation, allowing him to continue his behavior without consequence. Unknown to them, Voller was actively pimping out a young girl to older men at the time. Chrystul Kizer was 16 years old when she first encountered Randall Voller III at a bus stop in 2016. At the time, she was struggling, financially, emotionally, and mentally. She came from a difficult background, dealing with hardships that made her vulnerable. Voller saw that, and he took advantage of it. At first, he seemed kind, helpful, generous. He offered her money, rides, food, small things that made her life feel a little easier. But this wasn't generosity. It was grooming. Over time, Voller's influence grew. He had money. He had power. And he had no intention of letting her go. By the time Chrystul realized the full extent of who Voller was, it was too late. Over the next 2 years, he would sexually assault her and pimp her out to other men for his own pocket. What started as a way to survive had become a trap she couldn't escape, and by June 5, 2018, that trap would finally snap. It's June 5, 2018. For Chrystul Kizer, it's a night like no other. A night where everything she's endured, the manipulation, the fear, the hopelessness, would come to a head in a single fateful moment. After everything that had happened between Chrystul and Randall Voller, she found herself back at his house that night. The details are clouded by emotion, but what's clear is the overwhelming tension in the air as Chrystul entered the space that had long been a place of fear and manipulation. Voller's house, once a place where she might have felt taken care of, had become a trap. What was meant to be a safe space quickly turned into a pressure cooker of tension. Chrystul knew this visit was unlike any other, but what she didn't know was that this was the moment where everything would change. It started as it often did: awkward silences, quiet exchanges, the weight of unspoken tension hanging in the air. But this time, something was different. Chrystul, having grown tired of Voller's actions, resisted his advances more firmly than she ever had before. She wasn't just angry, she was terrified. The confrontation escalated quickly. What had started as a moment of resistance became a volatile clash of wills. Voller's anger flared as Chrystul refused to comply with his demands. The manipulation that had gone on for so long now reached its boiling point. Chrystul had had enough. In the heat of the moment, in a split second of desperate self-defense, Chrystul grabbed a gun. Whether in panic or to protect herself, no one will truly know the exact sequence of thoughts that raced through her mind. What we do know is that in that moment, she shot Randall Voller. The bullet struck him, taking him down, but Chrystul wasn't done. The chaos that had unfolded in that house now found its next chapter. Her actions were impulsive. She wasn't planning this. She was surviving. After the shot rang out, Chrystul, still in shock, grabbed a lighter and set the house on fire, her last attempt to erase the man who had tormented her for so long. What happened next was nothing short of tragic. With the house engulfed in flames, Chrystul didn't stop to look back. She fled, in Voller's car, leaving the only home she had ever known behind. A house that was now reduced to ashes, both literal and metaphorical. The act of setting the fire seemed to give her some control over a life she had long felt powerless in. But what awaited her was the stark reality of what had just occurred. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty rushed in as she took off down the road. As she drove, Chrystul turned to Facebook Live, sharing the aftermath of what had just happened. It was her attempt to explain herself, to let the world know what she had just done, and perhaps in some way to help herself process the chaos of the night. The next chapter of Chrystul's life would be one where the world would now decide what kind of person she was, a victim of abuse or a murderer. Her actions, meant to protect herself, would soon find her at the center of a media storm, her future uncertain and the outcome of her case poised to become a key point in a nationwide debate. The moment Chrystul was arrested, everything she thought she knew about her life shifted dramatically. On June 6, 2018, less than 24 hours after the shooting, Chrystul was apprehended and charged with first-degree intentional homicide for the death of Randall Voller. She had been brought into custody while the world watched in real time. Chrystul's arrest was swift, but the questions began to pour in. Was she a victim or a criminal? Chrystul's defense team argued that she had acted in self-defense, trying to escape a life of exploitation and manipulation. But the system didn't see it that way. Not yet. The prosecution's case was clear. First-degree intentional homicide. The narrative was that Chrystul had murdered Voller in cold blood, with no evidence to support claims of prior abuse. Bail was set at an astronomical $1 million. Chrystul's fate seemed sealed in those early days. The world had already judged her, a 16-year-old black girl accused of killing a 34-year-old white man. The case stirred emotions across the nation, with many questioning the fairness of the legal process and whether Chrystul's background and circumstances would be properly considered. But in a twist of fate, activists and social justice groups rallied around Chrystul. Her supporters flooded social media, creating fundraising efforts to secure her release. After months of legal battles, Chrystul's bail was reduced to $400,000, and after nearly 2 years in jail, the funds were successfully raised by various organizations and individuals. She was released, but her freedom was a double-edged sword. The damage had already been done. Her reputation, already tied to the shooting, was forever etched in public opinion. What many didn't know was that Chrystul's legal team was preparing to invoke a powerful defense, the affirmative defense for trafficking victims. In Wisconsin, trafficking victims have the right to defend themselves against criminal charges if they can prove they were coerced or manipulated into committing crimes as a result of their exploitation. This statute was created to protect those like Chrystul, young, vulnerable, and manipulated into dangerous situations by predators. The challenge, however, was proving that she was indeed a victim of trafficking, which meant unraveling the truth about her relationship with Voller. But the legal battle was complex. Did Chrystul fit the criteria? Did her actions align with the legal definition of being trafficked? Her defense team would have to fight tooth and nail to convince the court that Chrystul's behavior was not born of malice, but rather the instinct to survive. The question became, could the justice system see past the narrative of a murderer and understand that Chrystul had been living in a cage of abuse for far too long? The battle for Chrystul's case raged on. It wasn't just about defending a young woman. It was about defending the very concept of justice for trafficking victims. And the stakes were high. In 2022, the Wisconsin Supreme Court issued a pivotal ruling that allowed Chrystul to present evidence of her trafficking at trial. This decision was a huge victory for her defense team and for advocates across the nation. It set a legal precedent that victims of trafficking should not be silenced or denied the opportunity to explain their trauma and the role it played in their actions. 2024 marked a pivotal moment in Chrystul Kizer's legal battle. After years of uncertainty, Chrystul made the difficult decision to enter into a plea agreement. She pled guilty to second-degree reckless homicide, a significant shift from the original charge of first-degree intentional homicide. By taking this plea, Chrystul avoided the possibility of a life sentence, a terrifying reality she'd been facing since the night she shot Randall Voller. The terms of the plea deal meant that Chrystul's defense team would not have to contend with a jury trial, and the prosecution would not have to pursue the harshest penalties available under the law. But the decision was not without its toll. To many, the plea was an acknowledgement of guilt, even if that guilt was tied to the trauma of her years of abuse and manipulation. It's a painful and complicated truth that no legal proceeding could ever fully untangle. How much of her actions were shaped by a lifetime of pain and exploitation? Yet the plea deal offered her a path forward, a chance to leave the horrors of the trial behind and accept a more predictable sentence. But even within that agreement, there was a looming question. Was this truly justice for a young woman who had been victimized for so long? On March 28, 2024, Chrystul Kizer stood before the judge for her sentencing. It was a moment that had taken years to arrive at, and yet, it felt like the final chapter in a story that was far from finished. The judge sentenced Chrystul to 11 years in prison, with an additional 5 years of extended supervision to follow. Her time behind bars would not be easy. 11 years of imprisonment for a crime that, for so many, represented the complexity of being a victim of trafficking and abuse. While the sentence was far less severe than what could have been handed down after a first-degree conviction, it still left Chrystul with a painful reality. Her life would be dictated by the criminal justice system for over a decade. The emotional toll of this sentencing was overwhelming. For Chrystul, the relief of avoiding life in prison was clouded by the deep sense of what could have been, a life lived differently, one free from exploitation and manipulation. But this is the grim reality of many young women like Chrystul, whose survival instincts collide with a system that does not always see them as victims. Her supporters, those who had rallied for her release, who had shared her story on social media and fought for justice, felt a sense of mixed emotions. They knew that 11 years still wasn't justice for Chrystul. They believed her story was one of survival, not one of malice. But like many, they also knew the battle was never just about Chrystul. It was about a larger conversation on how the system treats Black women, victims of trafficking, and those who seek justice in a world that often does not listen.